The morning Hazel Townsend arrived in Millhaven, Texas. The dust was so thick along the main road that she could taste it on her lips, and every single eligible rancher in the county had pressed his Sunday shirt and combed back his hair for the occasion. Every single one, that is, except for a man whose name she had not yet learned. It was the spring of 1878, and Millhaven sat like a stubborn boot heel pressed into the red earth of West Texas, a town that had clawed its way into existence through cattle drives and sheer human will. The Santa Fe Railroad had pushed a spur line through the county the previous year, and with it came commerce, with it came ambition, and with it came a particular practice that the town's wealthier citizens had organized with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for cattle auctions: the bride showing. Hazel had not come from a place of comfort. She had come from Abilene, Kansas, where her father had run a dry goods store that burned to the ground on the coldest night of December 1877, taking with it every bolt of fabric, every barrel of flour, every cent her family had managed to accumulate across 14 years of careful work. Her father, Gerald Townsend, had stood in the street watching the embers and said nothing. He had said very little since. Her mother, Clara, had written to every contact she possessed, and it was Clara who had arranged for Hazel to travel south to Millhaven, where a well-regarded circuit preacher's wife named Mrs. Dorothy Ainsworth coordinated the bride showings with the brisk efficiency of a woman who had decided that loneliness was a problem that could be organized out of existence. Hazel was 23 years old. She was not a timid woman. She had cheekbones that caught light like river stones, dark amber eyes that people tended to notice before they noticed anything else about her, and hands that were already accustomed to real work. She had agreed to come to Millhaven not because she was desperate but because she was practical, and because she had made a private promise to her father that she would find something solid to stand on. If that solid thing happened to include a good man and a piece of Texas land, she was willing to consider it. The stagecoach rattled her down onto the main street of Millhaven at 9:30 in the morning, and the sight that greeted her was something she had not quite imagined from Mrs. Ainsworth's letters. There were 14 men standing in a loose collection in front of the Millhaven Hotel, all of them holding their hats in their hands in varying degrees of uncertainty. Some were old enough to be her father. Some were young enough to still have the look of boys wearing borrowed coats. One of them, she noticed immediately, had mud on his boots that no amount of hurried wiping had fully removed. Mrs. Dorothy Ainsworth was waiting on the hotel steps, a broad-shouldered woman of 50 with silver hair pinned up so severely it seemed to pull her eyebrows into a permanent expression of pleasant surprise. She descended the steps with the purpose of a woman who had done this before. "Miss Townsend," she said, taking Hazel's gloved hand in both of hers, "you are exactly as your mother described. Welcome to Millhaven." "Thank you, Mrs. Ainsworth," Hazel said, looking at the assembled men with the kind of polite directness that made 3 of them look immediately at the ground. "We have 14 fine ranchers and landowners for you to meet," Mrs. Ainsworth said. "Each man has been vetted for character and land ownership. We will spend the morning in introductions and the afternoon in a social gathering at the hotel. By tomorrow, you will have a much clearer picture of your prospects." Hazel nodded. She had rehearsed her equanimity on the long stagecoach ride, and she was prepared to be gracious and thoughtful and fair-minded. What she had not prepared for was the question that arrived in her mind like a small, sharp stone as she looked at the 14 men arranged before her. "Mrs. Ainsworth," she said quietly, while the men were still organizing themselves into some semblance of a receiving line, "how many ranches are in this county?" Mrs. Ainsworth blinked. "Oh, quite a few. Perhaps 25 or 30 of significance. And there are 14 men here." "Yes, well," Mrs. Ainsworth smoothed her skirt, "some men are already spoken for, of course. And some simply did not respond to the invitation." "Was the invitation sent to all of them?" "It was sent to every eligible bachelor landholder in the county," Mrs. Ainsworth said, and there was the faintest flicker of something in her expression, not embarrassment exactly, but a kind of rehearsed dismissal. "Some men prefer their solitude, Miss Townsend. I would not concern yourself with those particular individuals." Hazel filed this information away. She smiled at Mrs. Ainsworth and turned to meet the first rancher, a wide-faced man named Robert Bledsoe, who shook her hand so vigorously she felt her shoulder socket shift, and she was gracious and thoughtful and fair-minded all morning long, exactly as she had intended. But the question stayed with her. The morning passed in a parade of introductions that blurred at the edges, men whose names Hazel catalogued carefully: Robert Bledsoe, large and loud; Thomas Hale, quiet and nervous; a pair of brothers named Preston who seemed to have come together out of uncertainty about which of them she was supposed to be considering; a silver-haired widower named Gerald Marsh, who kept telling her about his late wife's rose bushes in a way that made it clear he was not ready to stop being a widower. There were others. Some of them were genuinely kind. Two of them were interesting enough that she found herself asking follow-up questions. One of them, a compact and weathered man named Samuel Pierce, made her laugh twice, which she noted as significant. But through the luncheon that Mrs. Ainsworth organized in the hotel's main room, white tablecloths, cold chicken, sliced bread, and a pitcher of sweet tea, Hazel found herself watching the door with the same small stone of curiosity working its way deeper into her thoughts. It was the hotel proprietor's wife, a young Mexican woman named Rosa Delgado, who told her without meaning to. Rosa was pouring more sweet tea when Hazel asked her, in the gentle sideways manner that women in constrained circumstances learn to deploy, whether she happened to know any of the local ranching families. "Most of them," Rosa said, setting down the pitcher with a comfortable familiarity that suggested she had grown up here and planned to stay. "My husband's family has been here 20 years. Is there anyone in the county who is notable?" Hazel asked carefully. "A rancher, perhaps, who is known for his land." Rosa looked at her with sharp, dark eyes. "Known for his land," she repeated slowly. "Or for being particularly private," Hazel said. Rosa glanced toward the window that faced the main street and then glanced back at Hazel. She lowered her voice not out of secrecy but out of a particular kind of careful respect. "Calvin Garrison," she said. "He has the biggest spread in this whole county, almost 4,000 acres north of town along the Cimarron Fork. He built it himself from a single quarter section his father left him. He does not come to town much." "Did he receive Mrs. Ainsworth's invitation?" Hazel asked. "He received it," Rosa said, and now there was a small smile at the corner of her mouth that she did not try very hard to hide. "Whether he paid it any attention is a different question." Hazel looked down at her sweet tea. "What is he like?" Rosa picked up her pitcher again. "He is the kind of man who, if you ask him a question, he thinks about it before he answers," she said. "There are not many like that in this county." She moved away down the table, and Hazel sat with the information settling into her like water into good soil. The afternoon social was pleasant enough. Samuel Pierce asked her to walk with him around the hotel's small courtyard, and he talked about his horses with a genuine animation that she appreciated. Thomas Hale brought her a small bunch of wildflowers that he had clearly been holding behind his back for some time, and the stems were slightly crushed, and the gesture was therefore more touching than a perfect bouquet would have been. Robert Bledsoe told a story that went on for 22 minutes, and that Hazel endured with good humor and iron patience. She was thoughtful, and she was fair, and she was genuinely trying. But that evening, when Mrs. Ainsworth sat across from her in the small parlor that had been arranged for their private conference, Hazel asked the question that had been growing all day. "Mrs. Ainsworth," she said, "can you tell me about Calvin Garrison?" Mrs. Ainsworth's face did something careful and controlled. "What have you heard?" "Only that he has a large spread north of town. I noticed there were only 14 men present today, and I know there are more eligible landholders in the county." "Mr. Garrison is a perfectly respectable man," Mrs. Ainsworth said, which was an interesting way to begin, Hazel thought, because she had not implied otherwise. He simply has no interest in social arrangements of this nature. He has declined every such invitation for the past 3 years. He is 31 years old, he has more land than almost anyone in the county, and he appears to have decided that he does not need company. She folded her hands. I would advise you not to spend your energy in that direction. Is there any reason I should avoid him? Is he a difficult man? Is he unkind? No, Mrs. Ainsworth said, with the reluctant honesty of a woman who would not lie directly. He is none of those things. He is simply reserved. He keeps to himself. And a woman who has come all the way from Kansas deserves a man who wants what she is offering. Hazel looked at her hands. I appreciate the advice, she said. She did not say that she had decided to go find him. She did not say it that night. She decided it across 3 hours of careful thought while the Millhaven Hotel's cotton sheets rustled around her and the sound of the Texas night came through the thin walls. A coyote somewhere distant, the creak of the building settling, the low voices of 2 men on the porch below. She thought about what Rosa Delgado had said. The kind of man who, if you ask him a question, thinks about it before he answers. She thought about the 14 men she had met, and she thought about the gap in the number, and she thought about the fact that Calvin Garrison had received an invitation and chosen, deliberately and consciously, not to come. That choice told her something. She was not entirely sure what it told her, but it told her something. In the morning she dressed before sunrise, put on her most practical traveling skirt, laced her walking boots, and went downstairs to find Rosa Delgado, who was already in the kitchen with a pot of coffee and the look of a woman who had been expecting exactly this. North along the Cimarron Fork, Rosa said, pouring her a cup. You'll take the main road north out of town for about 4 miles. There's a fork with a dead cedar on the left side. You go right. His ranch gate is another mile up. You'll see the Garrison name on the crossbeam. Hazel drank her coffee. Thank you. Do you want me to arrange a horse? Rosa asked. Please. He may not receive you well, Rosa said, not unkindly. That is a risk, Hazel agreed. Rosa studied her for a moment. There was something in Rosa's face that was not quite amusement and not quite admiration but lived in the territory between them. I will have a horse ready in 20 minutes, she said. The morning was already warm in the particular way of Texas spring, the light coming up gold and horizontal across the flat land, the mesquite trees casting their thin shadows like pencil lines across the red dirt. Hazel rode north on a steady gray mare that Rosa called Dulce, and she tried to arrange her thoughts into something like a reasonable plan. She had no formal excuse to call upon a man who did not know her. She had no letter of introduction. She had the truth, which was that she had come across the state of Texas looking for something solid to stand on, and she had a feeling unreasonable, possibly foolish, stubbornly persistent, that she ought to at least know why the one man with the most land in the county had not seen fit to come and have a look. The dead cedar at the fork was exactly where Rosa had said it would be. The Garrison name was on the crossbeam above the gate, burned into the wood with a clean, sure hand, no decoration, just the name doing its single necessary job. She rode through. The approach to the main ranch buildings was longer than she expected, a full quarter-mile of good pasture on either side, the grass winter-brown but thick, cattle moving in the middle distance with the calm deliberation of animals that had never been crowded or frightened. There was a barn large, well-built, with fresh boards along one side where repairs had recently been made. There was a bunkhouse. There were corrals in good order. And there was the main house, which was the thing that stopped her entirely when she came around the gentle curve of the lane and saw it. It was a solid house, timber-framed and whitewashed, with a stone chimney at each end and real glass in the windows. It was not a grand house by any Eastern standard, but by West Texas ranch standards, it was something that spoke of long-term intention, the house of a man who was building to last. And in front of the house, down on his knees in the morning light with a hammer in his hand and a pile of fresh-cut lumber beside him, was a man she had never seen before. He was working on something along the front of the house. She could see the framework of posts going up, the beginnings of a porch floor being laid, boards fitted with the careful attention of someone who was doing this properly rather than quickly. He had not yet heard her come up the lane. He was entirely absorbed in the work, and there was something in the way he moved, measuring twice, setting the board, driving the nail in 3 clean strokes, that told her more about his character than any description from Rosa Delgado could have. She stopped the mare about 30 feet away. He heard her then. He turned, and she saw him fully for the first time. Calvin Garrison was not an imposing man in the way that Robert Bledsoe had been imposing, all scale and noise. He was built solidly and practically, the way good ranch tools are built, with nothing added that did not serve a purpose. He was 31, as Mrs. Ainsworth had said, and the years of outdoor work had weathered him in a way that read as honest rather than harsh. He had dark brown hair that had been growing out past the point where it needed a cut, and gray eyes that were, at this moment, looking at her with undisguised surprise. He stood up slowly. He held the hammer at his side. He did not say anything for several seconds, and Hazel recognized this as the behavior Rosa had described. A man who thought before he answered. "Good morning," Hazel said. "Good morning," he said. His voice was low and measured. "You're on private land." "I am," she agreed. "My name is Hazel Townsend. I came from Abilene, Kansas on the stage 3 days ago." "I believe you received an invitation from Mrs. Dorothy Ainsworth." He looked at her steadily. He did not look hostile, but he looked very careful. "I did," he said. "You did not come." "No," he said, "I did not." She looked at the porch framework. "What are you building?" He glanced down at the lumber as if he'd momentarily forgotten it was there. "A porch," he said. "It looks like good work," she said genuinely. He studied her with those gray eyes, and she had the unusual sensation of being seen with some accuracy. "Miss Townsend," he said, "I appreciate the directness of your calling on me, but I should tell you plainly that I am not interested in whatever arrangement Mrs. Ainsworth has organized." "Why not?" Hazel asked. He blinked. Clearly people did not often follow up his declinations with direct questions. "I beg your pardon. Why are you not interested?" she asked. "I'm not asking an argument. I'm genuinely curious. You have a large, well-run ranch. You clearly intend to stay here for a long time. You're building a porch, which is the act of someone who is not considering moving anywhere. You are of appropriate age. I would think you might at least want to know who was coming." He was quiet for a moment. A horse in the corral snorted somewhere behind the barn. The morning light was getting warmer. "Would you like to get down off that horse?" he said finally. "This conversation will give me a crick in my neck." It was not exactly an invitation, but it was not a dismissal either. Hazel swung down from the mare with the practiced ease of someone who had ridden since childhood, and she tied the reins to the fence post nearest to hand. He set down his hammer on the stack of lumber and faced her. Up close, she could see that his hands were roughed up from the work in the way that was permanent now, the calluses built over years, and she thought that these were the hands of a man who had never asked someone else to do work he could do himself. "What do you want, Miss Townsend?" he asked, and it was not an unkind question. It was a genuine one. "I want to know why you didn't come," she said, "and then I want to decide whether the answer is interesting or whether I should ride back to town and give Samuel Pierce a fair chance." Something moved in his expression that might, under different circumstances, have been the beginning of a smile. "Samuel Pierce is a decent enough man," he said. "He made me laugh twice," Hazel said. "That counts for something." "It does," she agreed. "But I'm here instead of there, so." She gestured slightly with her hand, a simple gesture that said, "Here we are." He looked at her for a long moment, and she could see him deciding something, could see the deliberation happening in the small shift of his eyes. "Come sit down," he said, and nodded toward the rough steps of the porch in progress. "The finished part holds." They sat on the front steps of the half-built porch, and the Texas morning spread itself out in front of them, the wide pasture, the cattle moving slow and golden in the distance, the sky coming up into its full blue height. "I didn't come," he said, because I have watched 3 of those bride showings in this county over the past years, and what I have seen is this. It treats a woman like livestock at a market, and it treats a man like he is buying something rather than meeting someone. He paused. I don't want a transaction. I don't want to stand in a line and be evaluated. I don't want to, he stopped. I don't want to participate in something that starts out with both people being embarrassed. Hazel looked at his profile. That is the most thoughtful objection to the bride showing I have ever heard, she said. I have heard the rest of them. Too proud, too shy, too set in their ways. But that is actually a thoughtful objection. Does it change your assessment, he asked. Of you, she considered. Yes. He turned to look at her directly then. You came all the way from Kansas. My father's store burned down in December, she said, and she said it plainly without self-pity, because self-pity was not going to rebuild anything. I came here because I am practical, and because I am not willing to sit in Abilene and wait for circumstances to improve on their own. I came with open eyes. And you rode out here alone to find the one man who didn't show up, he said. I am interested in gaps, she said. When everyone does one thing, I want to know about the person who did the other thing. He was quiet for a moment. Somewhere beyond the barn, one of his ranch hands was moving, a young man who glanced over toward the house and then glanced quickly away, pretending not to notice the conversation on the porch steps. How long are you in Millhaven? Calvin asked. Mrs. Ainsworth has arranged for 2 weeks, Hazel said. She expects I will make a decision within that time. And if you don't? I don't know, she said honestly. I suppose I go back to Abilene and help my father figure out what comes next. He nodded. He picked up a wood shaving from the step and turned it in his fingers. I am going to say something direct, and I hope you will not take offense. I appreciate direct, she said. I am not easy company, he said. I have been alone on this ranch for 6 years. I have 2 hands who work for me. I go to town once a month for supplies, and I talk mainly to my horses, which are better listeners than most people I've met. I have forgotten, I think, how to be easy company. Hazel looked at the porch he was building. She looked at the straight lines and the careful joints and the wood that had been chosen with intention. You are building a porch, she said. A porch is where 2 people sit in the evening and talk. A man who only wanted to be alone does not build a porch. The silence that followed that observation lasted long enough that a mockingbird somewhere in the mesquite behind the house ran through 3 different borrowed songs. No, Calvin said quietly. I suppose he doesn't. She did not stay past noon. She understood instinctively that staying longer on the first visit would not serve what was quietly beginning. She got back on the gray mare named Dulce, and he stood in the yard below and looked up at her with those gray eyes that were still careful but no longer quite so closed. May I call on you again? She asked. He looked at her for a beat. I will finish the porch floor by Thursday, he said, which was not a yes but was very close to one. She rode back toward Millhaven along the road through the morning heat, and she felt something in her chest that she was not ready to name yet. Something that was not quite hope and not quite certainty but lived between them, warm and tentative as new grass. Mrs. Ainsworth was waiting for her at the hotel with the expression of a woman who had spent the better part of the morning managing her anxiety through the organization of linens. Miss Townsend, she said, where on earth have you been? Riding, Hazel said. I went north along the Cimarron Fork. Mrs. Ainsworth's expression shifted into something between exasperation and resignation. You went to the Garrison ranch. I did. And, Hazel took off her riding gloves. He is building a porch, she said. I am going back on Thursday. She was fair to the other men. She spent the following days exactly as she had promised herself she would, giving attention and genuine consideration to each of the 14. She walked in the hotel courtyard with Samuel Pierce again, and found that his humor wore well, that it was consistent rather than performative. She had a long conversation with Thomas Hale about farming practices in the western counties, and discovered that under his nervousness, he had more intelligence than his first impression suggested. She ate supper at a table with Robert Bledsoe and 3 other ranchers, and managed the evening without losing her patience entirely. but she thought about Calvin Garrison and the porch floor. On Wednesday evening, she sat in the hotel parlor and wrote a letter to her mother. She described Millhaven, the heat and the flat red land, and the way the sky was so large it felt like a different sky from the one over Kansas. She described Mrs. Ainsworth with affection. She described Samuel Pierce's humor. She did not write about Calvin Garrison, not because she was hiding it but because she did not yet have the right words, and she had learned from her mother that some things required the right words before they could be committed to paper. On Thursday morning she rose again before sunrise and went down to find Rosa, who had the gray mare ready without being asked and who handed her a cloth-wrapped package that smelled of something baked. "What is this?" Hazel asked. "Cornbread," Rosa said. "You do not call on a working man at his ranch empty-handed." Hazel looked at her. "You are a remarkable woman, Rosa." Rosa made a dismissing sound and went back toward the kitchen, but there was a warmth in the set of her shoulders. Hazel rode north again. The morning was cooler, a cloud cover coming up from the southwest that cast the land in a pearly light that made everything look freshly made. She came through the gate with the Garrison name burned into the crossbeam and rode up the lane, and before she even came around the curve she could hear the sound of a hammer. He had made significant progress. The porch floor was almost entirely down. The boards fitted tight and true, and he was working on the railing posts now, setting them at measured intervals with a plumb line. He heard the mare this time from further off, and he stood up and watched her come up the lane with an expression that was still guarded but that had shifted, she thought, in the direction of something easier. He had also, she noticed, changed his shirt. "Thursday," she said, swinging down from the mare. "You are punctual," he said. She held up the cloth-wrapped cornbread. "Rosa Delgado's," she said. "I am told one does not call on a working man empty-handed." He took it from her and turned it in his hands. Something moved across his face that she recognized as genuine appreciation, not for the food specifically, but for the thought behind it. "Come inside," he said. "I'll put some coffee on." The inside of the house surprised her, and she thought later that it probably should not have. It was clean and functional in the way of a man who had never developed the habits of mess, but also had no one to decorate for. There was a stone fireplace in the main room, a solid table with 4 chairs, and bookshelves along the eastern wall that she had not expected 2 full shelves of books, well used, the spines cracked from reading. She went to them immediately, the way she always went to books in unfamiliar rooms. "What are you reading?" she asked. He set the cornbread on the table and moved toward the stove. "Right now." "A History of the Republic of Texas," he said. "And before you say anything, I know I'm 30 years late to that subject." "I was not going to say that," she said, pulling out a thin volume. It was a copy of Oliver Twist, thoroughly read by the look of it. "I was going to ask whether you had read this." 3 times, he said, without turning from the coffee. She looked at him. "Why 3 times?" "Because the first time I read it I was angry," he said, putting the pot on the stove. "The second time I read it I understood it better. The third time I read it, I think I finally understood what Dickens was actually saying about how a society treats its most vulnerable people." She set the book back on the shelf very carefully, with the particular care one uses when handling an object that has just become more valuable than it appeared. "I read it once," she said. "I think I need to read it again." He turned from the stove and found her looking at him with those amber eyes, and he looked back at her, and there was a moment of pure, unguarded silence between them that was different from the careful conversation on the porch steps, something more honest, something that moved under the surface of words. "Sit down," he said, and this time it was an invitation without any qualification. They drank their coffee and ate Rosa's cornbread at the table by the window that looked out over the front yard and the half-built porch, and they talked for 2 hours. She told him about Abilene, not the burned store, not the financial particulars, but the town itself, its character, the way the cattle drives had shaped it, and then the railroad had reshaped it into something different, the way the landscape of the place had changed in her lifetime from open range to fenced land. He told her about coming to this particular piece of ground. How his father, a man named James Garrison who had come west from Tennessee before the war, had staked a quarter-section claim in this county in 1864 and had barely held it, had struggled and scraped, and finally, in 1872, had died of a fever that the doctor in town could not identify with any certainty. Calvin had been 25. He had inherited the quarter-section and a debt of $200 and a single horse. "I worked for 3 years as a hand on other men's ranches," he said. "Saved everything, bought more land, built the barn first, then the bunkhouse for when I could afford hands, then the house." He looked out the window. "The porch should have been part of the house from the beginning," he said, with a quiet frankness that she understood was self-assessment rather than regret. "I kept saying I would get to it." "And now you are getting to it," she said. "Now I am getting to it," he agreed. She looked at the bookshelves, the table, the room. "What made you start the porch now?" she asked. "After all this time." He picked up his coffee cup. He turned it in his hands the way he had turned the wood shaving on the first morning. She was beginning to recognize this as a thinking gesture, the physical form of the pause before the considered answer. "I turned 31 in February," he said. "And I sat here one evening and looked at the room and realized that it is a room for living alone, and I had built it that way on purpose, and the purpose had—" He stopped. He set down the cup. "The purpose had run its course," he said. "I don't know that I was ever truly built for being alone. I think I just believed for a while that it was simpler." She did not say anything. She let the answer live in the air where he had placed it. "And then Mrs. Ainsworth's letter came," he said. "But you didn't come to the showing," she said. "No," he said. "I didn't want a showing, but I started building the porch the day after the letter came." He looked at her, and for the first time she saw a kind of humor in his eyes, slow and dry and very genuine. "Make of that what you will." She started to laugh. It was not the polite, managed laughter she had deployed at the social gathering or the genuine but controlled laugh she had given Samuel Pierce twice. This was a full, real laugh, surprised out of her, and it changed the atmosphere of the room the way a window opening changes the atmosphere of a room. He watched her laugh, and his own expression did something complicated and tender. "I am glad you came out here," he said, quietly enough that it felt like something he was saying to himself as much as to her. She rode back to Millhaven that afternoon with the afternoon light going orange and long behind her, and this time she did have the words. She did not write them in the letter to her mother yet, but she had them. In the days that followed, Hazel did not abandon her obligations to Mrs. Ainsworth's arrangement. She was too honest for that and too fair. She attended the picnic that Mrs. Ainsworth organized on Saturday afternoon in the town's small park, and she sat with Thomas Hale and found that he had been practicing conversation in the intervening days and was somewhat better at it, which she respected. She accepted a brief walk with Samuel Pierce and told him gently but honestly that she found him genuinely likable and that she hoped he found someone who would do justice to his humor, and he looked at her with the eyes of a man who had already understood where things stood and had decided to be gracious about it. "It's Garrison, isn't it?" Samuel said. It was not quite a question. She considered denying it. "I don't know yet," she said honestly, "but possibly." "He's a good man," Samuel said without apparent bitterness. "He's a very good man. He doesn't say much, but what he says tends to be worth hearing." He looked at her. "I think you are well matched if that counts for anything coming from me." "It counts for more than you might think," she said. She went back to the Garrison ranch on Monday and on Wednesday and on the following Saturday. Each time the porch was further along. Each time the conversation was different, not deeper in the relentless way of people determined to establish intimacy, but deeper in the way of two people who are genuinely interested in each other and keep finding new corners of that interest to explore. She told him about her mother's bravery after the fire, the way Clara Townsend had sat down and made a list of every option available, and had worked through them with the steady determination of someone who refused to be overwhelmed. He listened with his full attention and said, "She sounds like someone you inherited a great deal from." She told him about her years helping in the dry goods store, the arithmetic and the ordering and the slow satisfaction of useful work. He told her about the mathematics of ranching, the carrying capacity of pasture, the calculation of a cattle drive's profit against its risk, and there was something between them in that conversation, a recognition that they both found pleasure in the practical side of things, in the real work of keeping a life in order. He showed her the ranch properly on the Wednesday visit, saddled his best horse and rode the boundaries with her, showing her the creek that fed the east pasture, the cedar breaks where the cattle sheltered in the worst summer heat, the high ground at the north end of the property where you could see, on a clear day, a vast and humbling distance in every direction. She stood on that high ground and felt the wind come up from the southwest and looked out over the enormous plain of West Texas and felt something settle in her that had been unsettled since December. "This is good land," she said. "It is," he said. He was standing beside her on the high ground, close enough that she could feel the warmth he radiated after the long ride, and he was looking at the land with an expression that was ownership and love and responsibility all mixed into one. "It is very good land." She turned to look at him rather than the land. He was already looking at her. They were both still for a moment in the wind. "Calvin," she said, and it was the first time she had used his first name, and she watched him register it. "Hazel," he said quietly. "I want to be direct with you," she said. "I am direct by nature, and I have found that pretending otherwise causes more trouble than it saves." "I know," he said. "I have noticed this about you. I find it," he stopped. "I find it one of your better qualities." "I think I would like to stay in Millhaven," she said. "I think I would like to see how this goes." She gestured with her hand that simple gesture she had made on the first morning. "Here we are. I am not asking you for a declaration. I am simply telling you where I stand." He was quiet for the beat that she now expected from him, the careful thinking pause. "I think," he said, "that I would like you to stay." On the following Tuesday morning, a letter arrived at the Millhaven Hotel for Hazel. She recognized her mother's handwriting before she had fully picked it up from the mail tray that Rose's husband maintained near the front desk. The letter was short, which meant it was important. Her mother used many words when things were going reasonably well and few words when she had something essential to say. "Your father has been offered a position as a bookkeeper with Farnsworth Trading in Abilene," Clara had written. "It is not the store, but it is solid ground. We are all right, Hazel. Take your time and be careful and be honest with yourself, and do not come home on our account. We are all right." Hazel sat in the hotel parlor for a long time with the letter in her hands. Then she went upstairs and wrote to her mother for the first time about Calvin Garrison. She described the porch. She described the bookshelves, and the fact that he had read Oliver Twist 3 times, and the third time had understood what it was saying about how a society treats its most vulnerable. She described the high ground on the north end of the ranch, and the way the wind came up from the southwest. "I do not know yet what this is," she wrote. "But it is honest, which seems like the right place to start." On Thursday of that week she arrived at the ranch to find not only the porch completed, every board laid, railing posts up, the whole structure as solid and fine as anything she had seen in the county, but 2 chairs on it. Simple wooden chairs, planed smooth and fitted together without nails rattling in loose holes, the kind of work that showed patience. He was in the yard when she came up the lane. He had been watching for her, she thought, though he arranged himself to look like he had merely been checking on something near the fence. She stopped the mare at the gate and looked at the porch. Then she looked at him. "2 chairs," she said. "2 chairs," he agreed. "You made them." "I made them," he said. He met her eyes, seemed like the point of a porch. She swung down from the mare and walked to the porch steps and climbed them and stood looking out at the view. From here you could see across the front pasture to the line of mesquite, and beyond it the land opening out in the direction of town. She turned and sat in one of the chairs. It was sturdy and well-balanced and exactly right. He came up onto the porch and sat in the other chair. They both looked out at the pasture for a moment. "I have something I need to say," he said. "All right," she said. He had his hands on the arms of the chair, and she could see the tendons in them, the roughness of the skin over the knuckles. "I have not been in a great deal of company these past years," he said, "and I have been aware, these past 2 weeks, that I have been differently aware of the time, that the mornings when you are coming are different from the mornings when you are not coming, and I have been thinking about what that means." She waited. The mockingbird in the mesquite had started up again. "I think it means that I have been, without quite naming it to myself, waiting for something," he said, "for a long time. And that the porch was the closest I could come to expressing that, because I did not know how to express it any other way." He turned to look at her directly. "And then you came through that gate." She looked at him. "You were building me a porch before you knew me," she said, and she said it softly, with the quiet wonder of someone who has found a thing they did not know they were looking for. "I was building it for someone," he said. "I did not know your name yet." She reached across the space between the two chairs and put her hand over his on the armrest. His hand turned under hers and held it, and it was such a natural, certain motion that it felt like something that had already happened 100 times. "I would like to be courted properly," she said. "I am not in a rush, and I think that what is good ought to be done carefully, but I want you to know that I am here and I intend to stay." He held her hand. The afternoon light came across the pasture in wide, warm bands. "I will court you properly," he said, with the same direct, considered quality that he brought to everything, so that it sounded not like a charming line but like a genuine promise. She stayed for supper that evening, and his cook, a rangy, leathery man of 50 named Pete, who had worked for Calvin for 4 years, and who clearly regarded Calvin's solitude with the same resigned protectiveness of someone who has watched a good animal refuse to come in from the rain, made a pot of beef stew and biscuits, and set it on the table, and then immediately found reasons to be in the bunkhouse. They ate at the kitchen table by lamplight, and the conversation was easy and warm, and entirely unlike the formal luncheons at the Millhaven Hotel. He asked about her childhood, and she told him about learning to read from her mother, about the summers when she had traveled with her father to the Kansas City markets and had been dazzled by the scale of the commerce, about the winter she was 12 and the blizzard had kept the family inside for 8 days, and she had read every book in the house and then begun rereading them in reverse order. He laughed at that. And his laugh was a quiet thing, genuine and a little rough from disuse, and it was possibly the best thing she had heard in Millhaven. She rode back to town in the dark, with the stars enormous overhead and Dulce knowing the road, and she felt changed in a way that she had not expected. She had come to Texas with practical intentions, and the practical intentions remained. She was not a woman who abandoned her reasoning in the face of warm feelings, but the feeling was there, too, solid and real and undeniable. She was falling in love with Calvin Garrison. She was also aware, in the way of honest people, that this created a practical complication. Mrs. Ainsworth's 2 weeks were nearly up. She went to Mrs. Ainsworth the following morning and sat across from her in the hotel parlor and explained the situation with the same directness she had used throughout. "I have spent the past weeks calling on Calvin Garrison," she said. "I know that is not what the arrangement was, and I am not asking you to facilitate it. I am telling you what has happened." Mrs. Ainsworth was quiet for a long moment. Her expression went through several things rapidly, moving from surprise through something that was close to consternation and landing, finally, in a place that Hazel thought might be respect, or at least its practical neighbor. "Calvin Garrison," Mrs. Ainsworth said carefully. "Yes." "He is a very private man," Mrs. Ainsworth said. "He is," Hazel agreed. "He is also kind and intelligent and deeply committed to building something lasting, and he made 2 chairs for a porch that he built in anticipation of company he did not yet have." Another silence. The clock on the parlor mantel ticked. "I see," Mrs. Ainsworth said, "and he is agreeable to this courtship." "He has asked to court me properly," Hazel said. "Yes." Mrs. Ainsworth folded her hands. "Miss Townsend," she said, "I have been organizing these bride showings for 7 years. I have made 12 successful matches. I'm going to tell you that in those 7 years and 12 matches, I have never had a situation quite like yours." She paused. "I hope you know what you are doing." "I believe I do," Hazel said, "but I appreciate the concern." "You will need somewhere to stay while the courtship proceeds," Mrs. Ainsworth said. "The hotel rate beyond 2 weeks is $12 per month. I want you to know that." She then looked at her folded hands and added, without changing her expression, "I also want you to know that my cousin Sarah Birch has a spare room in her house 3 streets from here, and she charges $8 a month and provides 1 meal a day. I will introduce you today if you like." Hazel smiled. "I would like that very much," she said. Sarah Birch was a widow of 55 who had outlasted 2 husbands and appeared to regard this as a personal achievement. She had a small house with a screened porch and a vegetable garden that she tended with aggressive affection, and she gave Hazel a room with a window that faced the morning sun. She also had opinions about everything and expressed them at steady, comfortable volume, and Hazel, who had grown up with parents who said what they thought, found this deeply comfortable. "Calvin Garrison," Sarah said, over supper on the first evening. "His father was a good man. I knew James Garrison when he first came to this county. Quiet man, honest man. Calvin is more like him than he probably knows." "What was he like as a younger man?" Hazel asked. "Reserved," Sarah said. "Even then, but not cold. That is a distinction that people sometimes miss. He was never cold, he was just," she searched for the word. "He was careful. He wanted to understand a thing before he committed to it. Still does, I imagine." "He does," Hazel said. Sarah looked at her across the table. "He is going to love you well," she said, with the bluntness of a woman who had been on this earth long enough to recognize certain things. "When he gets there, he will love you completely. Men like that, when they go all the way." Hazel looked at her plate. She felt something warm and large move through her chest. "I know," she said quietly. "I think that is why I rode out to his ranch in the first place. The courtship was careful and earnest and entirely good." Calvin came to town on the first Saturday of June and called on Hazel at Sarah Birch's house in the proper manner, hat in hand, with a modest bunch of Indian paintbrush that he had clearly gathered along the road and that were slightly wilted but vivid in their orange-red color. Sarah Birch answered the door and examined him for approximately 4 seconds with the thoroughness of a woman who had known his father and was taking the measure of the son. "Calvin Garrison," she said. "Mrs. Birch," he said. "It has been a long time." "You need a haircut," she said. He blinked. "Yes, ma'am. Sit on the porch. I'll tell Hazel you're here." She took the paintbrush from him with a practiced motion. "I'll put these in water." He sat on Sarah's screened porch and Hazel came out and they sat in the good morning air and talked for 2 hours while Sarah's cat navigated between their feet with great self-importance. He had brought a book, a collection of stories by Washington Irving, and he gave it to her with the slightly awkward presentation of someone who was not accustomed to giving gifts, and she turned it in her hands and felt the intentionality of it. "I thought you might like these," he said. He was writing about the frontier before most people were willing to think about it honestly. "I have never read him," she said. "He's worth your time," Calvin said, and said it with the simple confidence of a man who did not offer recommendations lightly. She read the book that evening and found that he was right. Over the following weeks, the courtship settled into a rhythm that suited them both. She came to the ranch on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and he came to town on Saturdays. On the ranch visits they rode and talked and worked, because she had never been willing to merely observe when she could contribute, and she found that helping with smaller tasks, shelling corn for the horses, helping to mend a section of fence, lending an extra pair of hands when Pete needed assistance with the kitchen garden, gave her a more real and grounded sense of the life she was considering stepping into. And it was a good life. She saw that clearly, without the distorting pressure of desperation or the blurring warmth of infatuation. The land was good, the cattle healthy, the ranch operation sound and honest. His hands, Pete, and a younger man named Louis who was 19 and from somewhere in the Texas Hill Country, were treated with fairness and paid consistently, which told her things about his character that she had already suspected but was glad to confirm. One Tuesday afternoon in late June, they were sitting on the completed porch watching a thunderstorm come up from the west, building itself into columns of purple and gray that lit occasionally from within with sheet lightning. The smell of rain was already on the wind, that green, electric smell that felt like a promise. "I want to tell you something," he said. "All right," she said. They were both watching the storm. "When I got Mrs. Ainsworth's letter," he said, "I burned it." She turned to look at him. "You burned it?" "In the stove," he said, with a look that mixed self-awareness with something rueful. "And then I went and got the lumber for the porch out of the barn. It had been sitting there for a year. I had bought it with every intention of building it the previous summer, and every week there was something else that needed doing first, and I kept putting it off." He paused. "I think that after I burned the letter, I was angry at myself, and when I'm angry at myself, I do useful work." She started to smile. "You built me a porch out of self-reproach." "In part," he said with that rare slow humor. "The other part was, I don't know exactly what you would call it, an argument with myself about what I actually wanted." The first rumble of thunder came across the plain, low and long. Dulce and his horses were already in the barn. "What did you decide?" she asked. He looked at the storm. "I decided," he said, "that the only thing worse than being known by someone was the prospect of never being known by anyone." He turned to her. "And then you rode through that gate." She reached for his hand where it lay on the arm of the chair. He took hers immediately, with none of the initial hesitance of the first time, natural and certain, as if this was simply how hands worked between them now. The rain came in a wall across the pasture, first gray in the distance, and then silver, and then suddenly present, beating on the porch roof with the joyful violence of a Texas summer storm. They sat in the two chairs he had built and watched the rain come down and held hands, and did not feel the need to say anything else for a while. He walked her out to the barn, where Dulce was stalled when the rain eased to a steady, lighter fall. He saddled the mare for her, and she put on her riding coat, and he helped her up into the saddle, and when she was mounted and the stirrups were checked and there was no further practical reason for him to be holding on to anything, he put his hand briefly against her knee, through the leather of the saddle fender, and looked up at her. "I'm glad you came out here," he said. "I have said that before, but I mean it more every time I say it." "I know," she said. "I can tell." She gathered the reins. "I am going to ask you something on my next visit that I need you to think about in the meantime." He looked at her carefully. "What is the subject?" She smiled. "That is not how thinking about it works," she said. "I'll see you Thursday." She rode through the rain toward town with her coat getting steadily heavier and a lightness in her chest that had nothing to do with the weather. She had, in the days before that conversation, been writing letters to her parents with more particularity. She had described Calvin with the honesty she brought to everything, his quietness, his self-sufficiency, his tendency to think before he answered, the bookshelves, the porch, the two chairs. Her mother had written back saying that she sounded like herself again, which was the highest possible endorsement Clara Townsend could offer. Her father had written a brief separate note in his careful bookkeeper's hand that said, "If he is the kind of man you describe, you know what to do. Trust your judgment, Hazel. It has never failed you." On Thursday, the day after the rain had left the land clean and bright, and the creek running fast over its stones, Hazel rode out to the ranch and found Calvin in the yard working with Louis on a section of corral fencing that the storm had shifted. She helped hold the post while Louis drove it, and Calvin watched her with that look she had come to know, the look that meant he was seeing her properly and was glad about what he saw. When the post was set and Louis had moved on down the fence line, they went to sit on the porch. "You said you had a question," he said. "I do," she said. "I want to know what your intentions are." He looked at her. The gray eyes were entirely steady. "My intention," he said, "is to ask you to marry me. The question in my mind has not been whether to ask, but when." He paused. "I have been a slow and careful man all my life, and I think you deserve to know that this situation is the first one in my adult life where I have found myself wishing I moved faster." She felt her heart do something large and uncomplicated. "I was not asking you to hurry," she said carefully. "I was asking where we stood so that I could write honestly to my parents." "Write to them honestly," he said. "Tell them I intend to ask you properly and soon, and that I will do so in a manner befitting the occasion rather than sitting on a porch." He paused, although I recognized the irony of the porch location. She laughed that real, full laugh, and he watched it with those eyes that had gone entirely warm. He came to town that Saturday and spent the better part of an hour at Millhaven's single dry goods store, which was run by a man named Augustus Crail, who had been in the county for 20 years and who sold everything from saddle blankets to pocket watches. Calvin came out of the store with a small package wrapped in brown paper that he carried with the kind of careful handling that suggested it was breakable or precious. He came to Sarah Birch's house and sat on the screened porch, and Sarah Birch, who was a woman of considerable social wisdom, told them she was going to check on something in the garden and disappeared with a timing that could not have been accidental. He did not get down on one knee. She had not expected him to and would not have wanted it. The theatrical gesture would have seemed wrong for the language they had developed together. He sat in the chair opposite her and put the brown paper package on the small table between them and looked at her. "I have been thinking," he said, "about what I want to say, and I have been finding that what I want to say is simpler than I expected, which is perhaps right." She waited. "I want to say that before you came through that gate, I was building a porch for someone I had not met. And now I have met you, and I know that the porch was for you specifically, and that the life I have been building on this land, the house and the cattle and the land itself, all of it feels more complete and more purposeful with you in it." He looked at her steadily. "I am asking you to marry me, Hazel. Not because I need help running a ranch, but because I want to spend my life sitting in the second chair." She looked at him. She felt completely, carefully, and entirely herself. "Yes," she said. "Obviously, yes." He opened the brown paper package and took out a ring, a gold band with a small garnet in the center, the color of red Texas earth, which seemed so right that she caught her breath. He put it on her hand with the careful, deliberate attention he brought to everything, and they sat in the two chairs on Sarah Birch's screened porch and looked at each other with the particular satisfaction of people who have found a true thing. Sarah Birch came back from the garden after approximately 2 more minutes with the timing of a woman who had been watching through the kitchen window, and she looked at the ring on Hazel's finger and said, "Good," with the crisp satisfaction of a verdict delivered. They were married in September of 1878, 6 months after Hazel had arrived on the stage coach from Abilene. The wedding was held in the small Methodist church on Millhaven's Eastern Street, with Reverend Thomas Ainsworth, Mrs. Ainsworth's husband, officiating. The church was full. 14 ranchers were among the guests, several of them visibly surprised to find themselves attending the wedding of the man who had not come to the bride's showing. Hazel's parents made the trip from Abilene. Gerald Townsend had filled out again since December, the bookkeeper's position restoring some of his steadiness, and he stood at the front of the church and watched his daughter walk toward Calvin Garrison, and his eyes were wet in the way of men who believe strongly in not crying and lose the argument. Clara Townsend had brought a quilt. She had made it in the month since Hazel's first letter about Calvin, a double wedding ring pattern in blues and creams that she had cut and pieced over the Kansas summer. She gave it to them after the ceremony with no particular ceremony of her own, just pressed it into Hazel's hands and said, "For the porch." Samuel Pierce was there. He made a toast at the wedding supper that was generous and funny and lasted exactly the right amount of time. He had, Hazel noticed, been talking to a young schoolteacher named Alice Wren for most of the evening with the animated attention of a man who has found an audience worthy of his best material, and she caught his eye at one point and smiled, and he smiled back with the good grace of a man who had found his next beginning. Rosa Delgado brought food to the wedding supper and did not stay long, but she found Hazel in the brief quiet before the supper started and held both her hands. "I am glad you asked me which way the road went," Rosa said. "So am I," Hazel said. "He will be a good husband," Rosa said, with the certainty of a woman who had known this town and its people long enough to make such pronouncements. "I know," Hazel said. "I recognized that about him from the second chair." Rosa laughed and released her hands and went back to the food, and Calvin appeared at Hazel's elbow with 2 glasses of water and the slightly dazed look of a man who has just been claimed by something larger than he expected and is entirely at peace with this. "All right?" he asked, handing her the glass. "Better than all right," she said. They moved into the ranch house that evening, which was perhaps not the grandest wedding night in the history of West Texas, but was entirely fitting. The house had been changed in the weeks before the wedding, changed by Hazel's presence during her visit days, by small accumulations of her things, by the quilt Clara had made folded over the back of the settee, by a new curtain at the kitchen window made from fabric she had found at Augustus Crail's store in a color that was exactly the blue of the sky above the north pasture. The house had been a room for one person. It had become, in increments, a room for 2. The porch was the best part of the evening, which surprised neither of them. They sat in the 2 chairs after the long day and the ceremony and the supper and the goodbyes, and they looked at the land going dark under a sky filling up with stars, and the quiet was deep in content. "We are married," she said. "We are," he said. "You started building this porch in February," she said. "I did, and I came through the gate in April." "Yes." She turned to look at him in the starlight. 2 months, she said. "The porch was waiting for me for 2 months before I arrived." He reached over and took her hand on the arm of the chair. "I think some part of me was waiting considerably longer than that," he said. She leaned her head against the high back of the chair and looked at the stars and thought, "This is solid ground." The first year of their marriage was a year of learning. Not difficult learning, not the grinding kind that comes from incompatibility or mismatched expectations, but the rich and sometimes surprising learning of 2 people who are genuinely discovering each other in the daily context of shared life. She learned that he rose before sunrise in all seasons, and that this was not a voluntary habit but a biological fact about him, the same way the color of his eyes was a fact. He learned that she was a reader who needed at least 1 hour of silence per day, which was not difficult to provide on a 4,000-acre ranch, but was a need she had never previously had occasion to articulate to anyone. She took over the ranch's financial records from a disorganized system of notes and receipts that Pete had been maintaining with the best intentions and the worst methodology. Within 2 months she had the accounts in order, a clear ledger, monthly summaries, a forward projection of expenses that Calvin read twice, and then set down on the kitchen table with an expression of genuine relief. "I have been doing this in my head for 6 years, he said. "I know," she said. "You have been doing it correctly, by the way, but doing it correctly in your head and having it written down are different things." "They are," he agreed. He looked at the ledger. "My father would have liked you," he said. "He had a great respect for order." "Tell me more about him," she said, and he did. He talked about his father over supper that evening for nearly an hour longer than she had ever heard him talk about a single subject, and she understood that these were things he had been carrying alone for 6 years, and that sharing them was both easier and more necessary than he had expected. The cattle prices in 1879 were good. There had been concern earlier in the decade about the cattle market, the kind of cyclical anxiety that was part of the economics of ranching, but the drives to the northern markets were paying well, and Calvin had 50 head in the spring drive that returned a solid profit. He reinvested a portion of it in new stock, a decision that Hazel had reviewed in the ledger and agreed was the sound choice. "We could also," she said carefully one evening in late spring, "invest in one additional ranch hand. Louis is doing the work of 2 men, and Pete is not going to be a young man forever." He looked at her. "I know," he said. "I have been thinking the same." "I know you have," she said. "You think about things longer than you need to sometimes." He smiled that slow, rare smile. "Is that a criticism?" "It is an observation," she said, "made with affection." They hired a third hand, a man named Ezra Washington who had come west from Georgia after the war and who had worked cattle drives for 10 years and who could, as Louis said admiringly, do more before breakfast than most men accomplished by noon. Calvin paid him the same as Louis and Pete, which was the right and fair thing to do, and which Ezra acknowledged with a nod that said he had worked for enough men to know the difference. In the evenings they sat on the porch. This was the constant of their days, the anchor point around which everything else organized. The porch as the place where the day was concluded and what mattered was understood. They talked about the ranch and they talked about books and they talked about the news that came from town, the continued expansion of the railroad, the changes in the cattle market, the slow transformation of the open range into fenced land that was reshaping the whole character of West Texas in ways that were both inevitable and, in some lights, melancholy. "The open range is ending," Calvin said one evening in the fall of 1879, with a tone that she recognized as something between acknowledgement and grief. "Within another 10 years the whole county will be fenced." "Is that wrong?" she asked. Not argumentatively but genuinely, he thought about it. "No," he said, "it is what happens. I fenced my own land. I have no standing to mourn the fencing of other people's." He paused. "But there is something about the idea of a horizon you can ride to that I am sorry to see go." She looked out at the darkening pasture. "We have 4,000 acres," she said. "That's a considerable horizon." "It is," he agreed, and she heard the comfort in his voice. By the summer of 1880, Hazel was pregnant with their first child. She told Calvin on the porch on a Tuesday evening in July, with the heat of the day still radiating from the boards beneath their feet and the first stars coming out above the cedar line. He was quiet for a moment that was longer than his usual thinking pause. Then he turned to look at her, and his face had done something entirely unguarded, all the careful reserve gone, replaced with something that was not a single emotion but several at once, layered and genuine and very bright. "Hazel," he said. "I know," she said. He reached over and took her hand and held it with a firmness that was different from his usual hold, more urgent, and she felt the full weight of his feeling in it. "Are you well?" he asked. "How do you feel?" "Tired," she said. "A little sick in the mornings, but well." She looked at him. "I feel very well." He brought her mother and father to Millhaven for the birth. He wrote the letter himself, a formal and careful letter that Hazel Townsend later described as the nicest piece of personal correspondence he had received in 20 years of business dealings. Clara came in October, 3 weeks before the expected date, with the quilt and another she had been making, and a quantity of advice that she delivered with love rather than prescription. Gerald came a week after, and the two men sat on the porch together in the November evenings and talked in the way of men who do not talk much but find, when confronted with an occasion of sufficient gravity, that they have more to say to each other than expected. The child was born in late November of 1880, in the room with the window facing the morning sun, with Clara and Sarah Birch both present and Calvin in the kitchen below, sitting at the table with his hands flat on the tabletop and his eyes closed, the way a man looks when he is asking something of a universe he is not sure is listening. It was a boy. They named him James, for Calvin's father. He brought James to Calvin wrapped in Clara's first quilt, and Calvin held his son with the same careful, deliberate attention he brought to everything, and looked at him for a long time, and then looked at Hazel with eyes that were wet in a way he made no attempt to manage. "He looks like a person," Calvin said, which made both Clara and Sarah Birch laugh, and which Hazel recognized as the highest possible compliment from a man who dealt in honest observations. "He is a person," Hazel said. "A brand new one." They named him James Calvin Garrison, and Hazel Townsend and Clara spent 2 more weeks at the ranch before returning to Abilene, and Sarah Birch came out from town 3 times in the first month with food and company and opinions, and Pete and Louis and Ezra took turns finding excuses to pass by the house, so they could look through the window at the baby, which they did with the bashful reverence of cowboys, confronted with something too small and significant for their usual vocabulary. The years settled into themselves with the satisfying density of a life that is being well lived. James grew into a sturdy, energetic child who had his father's gray eyes and his mother's amber stubbornness in equal parts. He followed his father around the ranch from the time he could walk, and his father let him, explaining everything with the patient thoroughness of a man who believes that the world should be understood rather than just inhabited. In 1882, Hazel had their second child, a daughter they named Clara Rose, for her grandmother, and for the paintbrush flowers on the Texas plain. Clara Rose had dark eyes and her mother's directness, and she was, from the very beginning, a child who asked questions and waited with fierce attention for the answer. The ranch continued to grow. Not rapidly, not recklessly, but steadily, with the same deliberate intention that Calvin brought to everything. By 1883, the herd had grown to 300 head. By 1884, they had purchased an additional quarter section from a neighbor who was returning east, and the fence line moved north to encompass a stretch of good creek bottom that improved the summer water situation considerably. The justice of the land was something both of them understood without needing to articulate it fully. They knew that the land they worked had been other people's land before, that the Comanche and other peoples had ranged across this same ground for generations before the pressure of settlement had pushed them from it. Calvin spoke of this sometimes with the measured honesty that characterized his thinking about hard things, and Hazel kept in her mind the reading she had done, the things she understood about how the West had been made and what had been lost in the making of it. They could not undo history, but they could hold it honestly, and they did. They were fair employers, fair neighbors, fair members of the Millhaven community that grew around them over the years. When a family named Bautista, who had been farming a small plot to the south, lost their irrigation to a rock slide in the summer of 1882, Calvin rode over with two of his hands and spent 4 days clearing the channel without being asked. When the county discussed building a school in 1883, Hazel attended every meeting and argued for a location and a curriculum that would serve all the children in the district, and her argument carried, and she served on the school board for 5 years. Thomas Hale, the nervous man who had given her the wilted wildflowers at the bride's showing, eventually married a widow named Maria Espinoza who had a son of 6 and a personality that complemented his quietness in exactly the way needed. Hazel ran into them in town one afternoon, and they had coffee at Rosa Delgado's hotel, and Thomas was, she thought, the most at ease she had ever seen him. Samuel Pierce did marry Alice Wren, the schoolteacher, in the summer of 1879, and they had 3 children in rapid succession, and a household that was reportedly full of laughter and organized chaos, which seemed right for the both of them. Rosa and her husband expanded the hotel in 1881, adding a second floor of rooms and a proper dining room that became the gathering place of Millhaven's social life, and Rosa ran the dining room herself with the same sharp competence she brought to everything. Mrs. Dorothy Ainsworth organized 2 more bride showings over the following years, and the results were as mixed as human nature suggested they would be. Some matches that held, some that strained, some that surprised everyone, including the participants. She came to Hazel's table at the church social in the fall of 1883 and sat down with the expression of a woman who is preparing to acknowledge something she has resisted acknowledging for several years. "I have a young woman coming from Missouri next spring," she said. "She is 24, she is sensible, and she has, in her letter, specifically asked me whether there are any ranchers in this county who are notable for their land and for their preference for solitude." Hazel set down her teacup. She looked at Mrs. Ainsworth with those amber eyes. "What did you tell her?" "I told her, Mrs." Ainsworth said, with the dignity of a woman making a controlled correction, that the most successful match I have ever witnessed in this county came about because a young woman from Kansas rode north along the Cimarron Fork without my instruction or approval to find the one man who had not come to the showing. She folded her hands. I told her to keep her eyes open. Hazel looked at her for a moment. Then she smiled. "That is very good advice," she said. "It is advice I should have given from the beginning," Mrs. Ainsworth said, with the brisk honesty of a woman who has decided that it is never too late to be right. On an evening in October of 1884, when the Texas sky had gone through its full range of performance, the gold and the orange and the deep rose and the last blue before darkness, Hazel and Calvin sat on the porch in the two chairs he had made 6 years earlier. The chairs had worn to exactly the right smoothness, every surface rounded to the particular shapes of the two people who had sat in them consistently for 6 years. James was asleep inside, 3 years old and ferocious in his dreams. Clara Rose was in her cradle in the main room, new enough to the world that she was still orienting. Calvin had come in from the evening rounds and washed up and sat down beside her, and they had been sitting for some time without talking, watching the last of the light go out of the sky. "What are you thinking?" she asked. He turned to look at her, and in the last light his face was the face she had come to know better than any face in the world, the gray eyes, the honest lines, the quality of attention that he brought to whatever he looked at, and that he brought to her every single time without fail. "I am thinking," he said, "about the morning you rode through that gate." And she said, "And I am thinking that I burned a letter that I should not have burned," he said, with the slow, rare humor, but that the porch was perhaps the better response anyway. She reached over and put her hand over his on the arm of the chair. His hand turned under hers and held it, as natural as breathing, as certain as the land around them. "It was the right response," she said. "I don't think I would have known what to do with a man who came to a bride showing. I think I needed to find someone who was already building something." He was quiet for a moment. "We are still building," he said. "We are," she agreed. "We have a considerable amount of building left to do." He squeezed her hand. The stars were coming out now over the cedar line, the big western stars that still made her catch her breath even after 6 years of living under them. Inside the house, James made a sound in his sleep, some small dream syllable, and then settled back into silence. The evening air was cool and clean with the smell of the grass and the cedar and the faint, distant smell of the creek running over its stones. "I am glad you did not come to the showing," she said. "Are you?" he said. "You were exactly where I needed you to be," she said, "building something real." He brought her hand up and pressed it briefly against the side of his face, a gesture she recognized as the full depth of what he felt. This man who expressed everything important through careful action rather than easy words, and then set it back on the arm of the chair but did not let go. They sat on the porch he had built in the last of the evening light, the two of them in the two chairs, with the wide and honest land around them, and the night coming down full of stars, and the house warm behind them with the life they had made together. And it was solid ground, exactly as she had promised herself she would find. Exactly as he had, without knowing her name, built a place for her to stand. In the years that followed, the porch aged beautifully, the wood silvering in the Texas sun and rain until it had the color of old driftwood, and Calvin replaced a board here and there with the same careful attention with which he had laid the first ones. They painted the house white again in 1886, and he repainted the porch floor as well, a deep red that was the color of the earth around them. James grew up to be a young man who had his father's patience and his mother's curiosity, and who showed, from the age of 10, a particular gift for understanding animals that Pete declared was the finest natural ranching instinct he had seen in 40 years of working cattle. Clara Rose grew up asking questions about everything, every system and structure and idea, and Hazel taught her from the ranch's ledgers, and from every book on the bookshelves, and eventually, when the Millhaven school expanded in 1888, from the curriculum of the school that Hazel had helped design, in which Clara Rose enrolled and immediately began outpacing her classmates with the focused intensity of a child who does not separate love from learning. Hazel had a third child in 1887, another boy, whom they named Gerald for her father. Gerald Townsend, the original Gerald Townsend, came from Abilene for the birth and held his namesake with the expression of a man who has been given back something he had not known he was missing. His bookkeeper's position at Farnsworth Trading had evolved over the years into a partnership, the fire's destruction having eventually, in the way of things that must be looked at from a long distance to be understood, led him somewhere better. Calvin and Gerald Townsend stood on the porch together the evening of the baby's birth, as they had stood together for James's birth 7 years before, and Gerald said what he had been meaning to say for 7 years. "I owe you a debt," he said. Calvin looked at him. "No," he said, "you don't. She is the best of everything we managed to do right," Gerald said, "and you knew that from the beginning." Calvin looked out at the dark pasture. "She rode through my gate," he said. "She did that herself." "She did," Gerald said, "but you built the gate worth riding through." There was nothing to add to that, so they stood in comfortable silence on the porch and watched the Texas stars, two men who had each built something lasting from difficult materials and who understood each other on that basis. The community of Millhaven continued to change and grow around them through the late 1880s and into the 1890s. The railroad brought more people, more commerce, the slow accretion of civilization that transformed the frontier town into something that would soon be unrecognizable to the people who had settled it. New houses went up, a second church, a proper doctor's office rather than the part-time arrangements of the previous decade, a newspaper. Calvin read the newspaper with the same thoroughness he brought to books, and he and Hazel read it together at the kitchen table in the mornings, which was one of the pleasures of their life that had continued unchanged from the earliest days. When Ezra Washington decided, in 1889, to stake his own claim on a quarter section to the east that had come available, Calvin spent 3 Saturdays helping him build the foundation of his house, and Hazel sent the family. Ezra had married a woman named Josephine who had come to Texas from Louisiana, every spare provision from the ranch kitchen. It was the right thing to do, and it was done without ceremony, which was the only way it could properly be done. The cattle business went through its cycles, the good years and the lean years alternating with the irregular rhythm of natural economies. The hard winter of 1885 took a portion of the herd, as it took portions of every herd in the county, and Calvin and Hazel sat at the kitchen table that February with the ledger open between them and worked through it with clear eyes and did not panic. They were not wealthy in the manner of the great Eastern fortunes, but they were prosperous in the manner that mattered most on the frontier. They had enough, and they had built it to last, and they were not dependent on luck holding in one particular direction. On the 1st of April, 1890, exactly 12 years after Hazel had ridden through the gate with Rose's cornbread, and a question about why the one man with the most land in the county had not come to the bride's showing, she sat on the porch in the chair that had become indisputably hers. The wear pattern of 12 years was unmistakable, and waited for Calvin to come up from the evening rounds. She heard him before she saw him, the particular rhythm of his walk on the dry grass, and she watched him come up from the barn and cross the yard and come up the porch steps, and he sat down in his chair and took off his hat and ran his hand through his hair, which still needed a cut in the way that it had always needed a cut, and she loved him with a completeness and a specificity that had grown deeper in 12 years rather than familiar in the way that wears down to habit. "Good day," she asked. "Good day," he said. He put on his hat on the railing and leaned back in the chair. "The south pasture grass is coming up well. The yearlings look strong." "James was out there this morning before school," she said. "Pete says he has a better eye for cattle than either of us." "He does," Calvin said with a quiet pride. "Clara Rose has finished the Irving collection," she said. "She wants to know what to read next." "Tell her to try Thoreau," he said. "She will argue with him, which is the right response." "And Gerald?" he asked, because Gerald the youngest was at the age of 3 that required checking on. "Asleep," she said. "Finally. He has your stubbornness and my stubbornness combined, which is a significant quantity of stubbornness." Calvin smiled. "He will need it." They sat in the last light of the April evening, and the land was beautiful in the particular way of the Texas spring, the grass coming up green after the winter, the wildflowers beginning in the lower pasture, the sky enormous and the color of something that needed a word more specific than blue. 12 years, she said. He looked at her. 12 years, he agreed. "Are you glad?" she asked. Not anxiously, with the calm of someone who already knows the answer and asks out of pleasure, not uncertainty. He reached over in the way he had always reached over, and she put her hand in his in the way she had always put her hand in his, and the chairs had worn to exactly the shapes of the two people who sat in them and had sat in them for 12 years of evenings. "Hazel," he said, and in the way he said it with the full weight of the word, her name doing everything he had ever found difficult to say all at once. She had the answer, complete and certain and good. She looked out at the land they had built together, the pasture going gold in the evening light, the cattle in the distance like dark moving marks on a landscape that was theirs, and that they had worked and loved and cared for, the barn and the bunkhouse and the corral and the children sleeping inside, and beyond it all the vast and beautiful sky of West Texas going through its nightly transformation from light to dark and stars. The porch held them, as it had always held them, solid and true, built with careful hands by a man who had started building before he knew her name, finished in the days before she came through his gate, 2 chairs set out for the conversation that would last the rest of their lives. She leaned her head back against the high back of the chair and felt the evening air, cool and clean, and she thought about the stage coach from Abilene and the 14 men in the hotel yard, and the small stone of curiosity that had taken up residence in her chest, and she thought about the dead cedar at the fork, and the name burned into the crossbeam and the sound of a hammer in the morning light, and she thought. Every single step of the road that led here was the right step, even the hard ones, even the uncertain ones, because all of them led to this porch and this man and this life, and there was nowhere else on earth she would rather be than in this chair, holding this hand, watching this particular piece of the world go dark under all these particular stars. 12 years, she said again, quietly, to herself as much as to him. And Calvin Garrison held her hand in the evening on the porch he had built, and looked out at the land and smiled.